Hi, my name is Hannah, and today we're interviewing Daniel. Daniel is a fund manager and entertainment entrepreneur based in New York. Today he gives us his view on business and economic trends as the curve flattens and we emerge into post-pandemic world.
This podcast channel is about you, successful international entrepreneurs, successful expats, successful investors. Sponsored by HCJ.tax.
Daniel, thank you for your time. Good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good, sir. I'm enjoying my time here in California. Was in New York most recently for last couple of months, but just recently got here this week. So, just even traveling here was pretty surreal. Going through JFK on Monday, there were more employees at the airport than passengers.
Wow.
And one of the things that was so interesting, usually a flight, the flight left at 8 and at 7:15 is usually the typical boarding time. And at 7:15, they made an announcement that boarding would be at 7:45 for 8 o'clock departure, because it just didn't make any sense to start boarding the, 15 passengers that early when, so it was just quite a surreal experience. But, post COVID-19 surreal experiences, kind of becoming the norm here.
Absolutely. Could you give us a bit of a background and kind of introduce yourself to those who may be watching and listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Daniel Michael Yearwood, full government name, born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. For those who are unfamiliar with Trinidad and Tobago, I attended St. Mary's College, which is a very illustrious high school. I think, we could safely classify it as the best high school in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Once I finished high school in Trinidad, came to the United States, did a bachelor's degree in computer science at Morgan State University. Back in those days, I actually thought I wanted to be a programmer, because I thought to myself, computer science is something that, is going to be broadly impacting, all sorts of industries. I'll never get bored. I want to be a programmer. And then I had an internship in the summer of 2006 at Credit Suisse, where I was on the software development team supporting the Forex traders. And that was my first real introduction to finance. And, I spent the entire summer trying to understand what investment banking was, what was the difference between asset management and private banking. And, by the end of the summer, I realized, what? I want to be in finance, not computer science. Okay. So, at that point, it was sort of too late to, change majors, senior year. So finished the computer science degree and got a job at Ernst & Young in New York, the IT group, but one that focused on financial services clients. So did that for a year. Then, we're just about to head into the crisis in 2008. Moved back to Trinidad and Tobago, and there I joined RBC. So I was a banker for 2 years, focused on a portfolio of Caribbean conglomerates, doing everything outside of their capital markets requirements. So term loans, revolving working capital facilities, that sort of thing. Left RBC and then spent a couple of months at the IFC, which is the sort of private sector arm of the World Bank. There I was an investment analyst covering infrastructure and natural resources. So we had a portfolio of different projects in the Caribbean where, some of them were sort of minority equity, sort of private equity style holdings. Others were more like, syndicated loans where IFC was sort of the lead lender, and you had a number of other multilaterals that piggybacked on them. So did that for a few months, and then...
And this was in Trinidad as well?
This was in Trinidad as well. So based in Trinidad, but we would travel around the region, need be, projects in Jamaica, Grenada, Puerto Rico, that sort of thing. Then fall of that year, so this is fall of 2011, came back to the US and started grad school. So I did a dual degree program, did an MBA at Wharton, where I majored in finance, and I did a master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School, and their focus was on international and global affairs. So, thinking about the global system, multilaterals, and how the monetary system works, things of that sort. I always knew at that stage I wanted to be in finance and investing, but the Kennedy School program felt like it would be a very good complement for me, both in terms of just being a better consumer of geopolitical news and politics. Most of my peers in that program were actually people who were either working in policy or planning to be politicians. And then I thought to myself that it was a very in future would prove to be a good investment in an alumni network where 10 years, 15 years down the road, people who've gone on to be senior ministers or Congress people, governors, would be a useful network to have. I have a very close friend of mine. She already has like a mapped out plan where she's going to be a senator someday, and I like 90% sure she's going to achieve everything she wants to do, unless she changes her mind and decides to do something else. So that dual degree program was a 3-year program, a year and a half at each school, and then each school counted 4 credits from the other school towards the graduation requirement. So instead of doing each degree sequentially in 4 years, you did them together in 3. And after graduating, I wanted to spend some time in the alternative investment industry, particularly the hedge fund space. So I joined fund of funds on the West Coast that specialized in funding startup hedge funds. So it was really a good opportunity to both get breadth across a range of different hedge fund strategies, but then also understand a lot of the operational nuances of hedge funds, particularly startup hedge funds, because a lot of our clients at the time, they had their own hedge fund portfolios, but those portfolios were focused on larger established hedge funds, the types that you'd read on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, whereas we were very often the largest investor or sometimes the only investor in some of these smaller startup hedge funds. So it really gave us the chance to give clients access to strategies that they didn't really either have access to themselves or would be too small, or niche strategies that they wouldn't be able to diligence very well themselves. So did that for 2 years. Decided I wanted to move back to the East Coast, and decided that I would join a startup hedge fund that was focused on global macro. A couple of months of trying to help that fund get off the ground didn't work out. Ended up back to the drawing board looking for a new opportunity. Ended up finding what at the time I thought was my dream job, which was a job at a family office that managed money for a wealthy family out of Hong Kong. And it would have been a generalist role where I would not only continue to learn more about cover hedge funds, but sort of broaden my expertise to a number of different investment areas. And then literally the day before they gave me an offer, the Trump administration suspended premium processing for H-1B visas. So instead of me getting that visa in 2 or 3 weeks, it was a 6-month wait before the company could even apply for the visa. And the funny thing is, the company had they had already found somebody else that they wanted to hire for this role before they even saw my resume. And when they saw my resume, they actually stalled that person, put me through a process, and then called that person, told the person that, sorry, but we're giving the role to somebody else. And then after the visa thing happened, they actually had to call the person back and be like, hey, just kidding, do you still want a job? So at this point, I'm unemployed, running on 7-8 months now. And my visa situation was such that I was in the US on a visitor visa, but at this point that's running out. I need to go back to Trinidad, and just totally coincidentally, through no grand plan or scheme of things, I had been going to the recording studio for a couple of months at that point. Just my cousin's boyfriend, he, rapped, and, he'd been going to the studio for years. And I always had, for a few years, I'd had this curiosity about recording. My roommate from college, he actually started recording soca and released soca, for like 2 years in a row prior to that. And, I kind of look at him as an older brother. So, when like you see like your brother doing something, you get curious and, you want to try it out too. So I'd been going to the studio for a couple of months, recording music, and I'd only been, circulating it to friends of mine, but, they all encouraged me. They were like, wow, like this is actually like, pretty good. Like, you should like, keep doing this. So back in Trinidad now, summer of 17, unemployed, I can't even really apply for jobs in Trinidad because I was very honest with people that, look, I'm actually trying to head back to the US in a couple of months. So people, weren't really interested in taking me on for a short period of time. So, I did the only thing that I felt like I could do during that summer. I listened to music. I listened to beats. There are these websites that sell instrumentals. And I just listened. I told myself, you know what? The one thing I could do this summer is make music, or at least write songs. So I'd listen to beats. I must have listened to thousands of beats that summer because I'd go on these websites for hours at a time, just listen through beat after beat. And every time I found a beat that I liked, I'd listen to it on repeat a couple of times. Then I started writing a song to it. By the end of the summer, I had, like 25 songs. And I thought to myself, wow, you know what? Like, this is something that I think I could really give a shot. So back to the US now. This is, September of 17. I start interviewing for jobs at, different fund of funds. End up getting a job at a large asset manager in the private wealth group where, my boss and I, we manage the hedge fund portfolio for private wealth clients. And it just so happened a number of the hedge funds that we were invested in invest in the like TMT space, so technology and media space. And while I began to have this idea about, starting an entertainment company, based on both my interests in, as a budding recording artist, but also just examining some of the tailwinds that, different segments of entertainment has. So, within music, recorded music went through this huge decline from 1999 until 2016, where the four of the sales of physicals, CDs, and has just led that market to be in a significant state of continued decline. But the advent of streaming has kind of turned that around, where the Spotify, Apple Music's titles of the world have really created a new model that kind of gives a runway for growth. And if you think about the type of tailwinds that music has, and you move over to places like TV and film and gaming, they have similar secular tailwinds that support those businesses as well. On the TV and film side, the Netflix and the OTT operators, and then on the gaming side, which itself had already had a very strong run. You think about the advent of 5G and the ability for mobile connectivity to be as such that you could not just operate the sort of older generation mobile games, but you could then have the possibility of cloud computing, where a lot of the gaming is happening in the cloud, and the device you're using, whether it's a cell phone or some other local sort of like dummy device, is able to just be an input device, and the calculations happen in the cloud. So I thought to myself, you know what, these are a number of different tailwinds that make this a very interesting investment opportunity. And coincidentally, because of my experience as a budding artist making music, I'd been able to combine those things to launch Mission Road Entertainment, which is a sort of a digital entertainment conglomerate building out content across those different areas. And now I'm in the process of actively raising capital from friends and family and angel investors. And on the music side, I plan to sign myself as the first artist on the music subsidiary. And I just recently released my fourth single, which I'm now in the process of building a team on the marketing side, and I have a publicist on the digital space that's going to help me sort of like really find and connect with the fans that that type of song will resonate with. So it's been a fascinating journey that if somebody asked me 3 years ago that one, I'd be an entrepreneur with a entertainment company, but two, that I myself would be an artist and I'd be singing and rapping, like it would have been the most far-fetched thing. But life has a way of taking these twists and turns, and I feel like to the extent you're open-minded and you recognize opportunities, and you feel like with enough thought and realizing the different resources you need to harness, you feel like you could pursue it. Life kind of leads you down these different roads, and you try to seize the opportunities that come your way.
Oh wow, what a journey, what an incredible journey. And so that's on your personal investor / entrepreneurial side. And in terms of your 9-to-5 job now?
Yeah, so on the 9-to-5 side, we manage roughly $1.5 billion hedge fund portfolio. The capital is spread across 25 different hedge funds. And the idea for us is that the private wealth client base of our asset management firm, away from this portfolio, they have a lot of exposure to broad risk drivers. So global equity markets, global fixed income markets. So we want this portfolio to be relatively uncorrelated. So sources of return that they won't get elsewhere are the types of things that we try to populate this portfolio with. And the most interesting thing about it is this portfolio was run by a different team prior to us inheriting it. And the prior team ran this portfolio in a completely different way. They invested in a lot of directional hedge funds that had high beta, so very much tied to how broad equity markets would perform. And they had a good run for a couple of years, but then in the fall of 2015, all of hedge funds were challenged. You had a number of things happening in the world at that time. When China was going through some issues, you had energy markets sort of cratering, and then by extension that led to a lot of problems in the high yield markets, because energy is sort of a disproportionate size of the high yield investing universe relative to if you think about equities. So this portfolio that we manage had some challenges in fall of 15 into early 16. So that's now led to a series of net outflows. So the clients of this portfolio have been redeeming from it for the last 4 years now, and our challenge has been to one, reorient the portfolio so that it now represents something that is more meaningful and more purposeful for them relative to the exposures they have elsewhere. But two, to also do the marketing job of explaining to clients that this portfolio is now something different than what the track record represents. So this portfolio has a track record from January 2012 that represents the old mandate, the way that the prior team managed the fund, and it's completely not representative of what we do now. We actually redeemed from 90% of the funds. So of the 25 funds we have in the portfolio now, one of those funds is a fund that we inherited. So it's really been a sea change of the underlying exposures, but it's still hard to entirely communicate that, because one, the financial advisors, they don't focus on hedge funds. They really spend a lot more of their time in the long only world of equity and fixed income. So a lot of the types of strategies we invest in, multi-strats, some fixed income RV strategies, global macro strategies, they're things that just aren't as familiar to them. So to get them to invest, it's getting them to not basically to go out on a limb that is on a tree that's like already shaky, because one, they don't understand hedge funds very well, and then two, notwithstanding what we say, this portfolio is attached to a track record that, if somebody walked off the street and came up to me and tried to get me to invest in a product that had this portfolio, I'd look at them like, a complete crazy person. Like, why would you expect anybody to give you money for this? The only reason that I work on this portfolio and I understand what is in it, so I don't feel that way about it. But I completely understand when somebody at an arm's length looks at me and looks at this track record and says, well, Daniel, how do you expect me to give you guys money for this? So I think part of our challenge is we need that track record that is a bit more challenged to be a bit further in the rearview mirror. And when people recognize that the 2019 onward performance is more representative of what we advertise, I think people would feel a bit more comfortable with investing in the product.
Okay, I'm with you. And on that note, that's a great segue. It's 2019 and onward. So 2020, this is unprecedented. We are where we are. What do you see on the other side of this? Eventually, we will come out of it, whether it's a month, 2 months, a year. So on the other side, what do you see?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. I think there are going to be a number of different changes. For starters, I've sort of intimately experienced, some of this, the challenges we're facing now, having actually gotten COVID-19 myself. So in early March, I started to feel ill. Went to the doctor and realized I had it. And what's ironic is I was actually traveling through Asia in late January, early February. I spent a couple of days in Singapore, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam. And while in transit, was transiting through Hong Kong airport, and my parents were so terrified. They were like, Daniel, why are you heading into the eye of the storm? Like, this thing is happening in Asia. Why would you travel to Asia right now? And I distinctly remember telling my father in early February, you know what? In a few months' time, this entire thing will either be blown over and it wouldn't be something we talk about, or this will be something that is going to be everywhere in the world. And in Trinidad, you will be wearing a mask, and it's just going to be everywhere. It's going to be one of the two things. So unfortunately, it's turned out to be the latter. But having had it for a couple of weeks, and now I've thankfully had a full recovery and been able to put it in the rearview mirror. I just think about a lot of the things that I took for granted, both in my finance investment job and on the entertainment startup. So for us, in my hedge fund investing job, it's ultimately a relationship and people business. So I spend most of my time either on the phone or meeting with hedge funds in person, hedge funds that we're currently invested with, or ones that we're thinking about investing with. And there's so much that you get in a in-person meeting, that you have lunch with somebody, or you go out for drinks with somebody afterwards, like building that rapport that is just not as easy to replicate on a phone call or video chat. So I've been trying to find ways to adapt to this new environment, and making a point of, I don't want to necessarily call it small talk, but having like a bit of the conversation in the early part of a call, or conversation, not just be delving right into the numbers or delving into business, but understanding what people are feeling, especially in this environment where it's all uncertainty. So I definitely spend a lot more time doing that. And on the entertainment side of things, I actually was planning to go to LA to shoot a music video for my most recent single, and had already had somebody scout a bunch of different locations, cast maybe about a dozen people to be in the video. And then all of a sudden I go to the doctor, I end up having this, COVID-19, and, that entire plan has to be scrapped. And what we ended up doing instead was my director had each of the couples that we cast to be in the video,
Mm-hmm.
give him a tour of their own apartments or houses,
Yeah.
and he actually then picked different locations in their apartments and around their houses to have them shoot, and he had them record, hours of footage to send to him that we ended up using in the final product. And it turns out that the final product, in my opinion, is something that is far more superior than if the original plan came together and we went and we shot, the location in LA we were planning to. So for me, it was a good example of how, you have to be adaptable in this environment. And, my dad always has a saying, when life gives you lemons, don't just make lemonade, make squeezy with extra added lemon, because you can sell, dishwashing liquid for more than lemonade. So it's kind of having that mindset where, you think about what are the things that could either have you achieve the same outcomes that you were going to have if the situation was not happening, either with a different creative approach, a different, potentially a different investment approach, and also, potentially at a lower cost, because there are going to be a lot of roles, I think, that we have not necessarily thought about, at least here in the West, as outsourceable, where we're like, I must have somebody in the office to do this. But when you think about, well, now if everybody's working remotely, and this is an aspect that people are doing remotely from home in, Hell's Kitchen or whatever part of Manhattan they live, why couldn't I have somebody do this for me from, Manila? Or from Jakarta. So I think there are going to be some companies, particularly given the financial pressures all of them are going to face, that are going to start thinking about outsourcing in areas that they would not have traditionally done. So I think part of it is going to be by necessity, where they sort of run down their list of expenses, and they think to themselves, geez, well, how am I going to adjust to this potentially 24-month period of slowdown? Where can I rationalize on the cost side? And then I think there are going to be some people who just think to themselves, oh, well, you know what, this is an opportunity where even if I don't necessarily rationalize my existing cost base, or don't necessarily use that as a driving reason for exploring this, just think about the plethora of talent that's out there in other parts of the world that you wouldn't have been able to access. So I'm always ever the optimist, and looking for the silver lining. And I feel like this could potentially be something where a lot of people in middle income countries that might not have necessarily been on the radar of companies in the richer world as potential employees or potential consultants could hopefully get opportunities that arise out of this, because it's one of the things that's always been back of my mind. I've now spent reasonable amount of time traveling through Asia. My fiance is from the Philippines, so I spend a ton of time in the Philippines, and it always strikes me whenever I meet bright young people that are coming out of school in these places, and they feel like their options are so limited. I mean, even where we're from back in Trinidad, and a lot of people have younger cousins and friends that graduate from university in Trinidad, and they feel like, well, I have all of these skill sets and this talent, these things that I spent years in school honing and developing, but now where the job is, where the opportunities to use that. So I want to hope that the expansion of remote work and is going to provide opportunities for people in these countries, where at the end of the day, it's a global talent pool. And if somebody in Trinidad, somebody in the Philippines, somebody in India is a talented digital marketer, they're a talented accountant, they're talented consultant, they a wide range of different fields that we could put into these categories. There's no reason why those people shouldn't be competing with the people that are in the US and Canada and the UK, because at the end of the day we didn't we didn't choose the country that we were born in, the circumstances that we grew up in. So I'm very much sort of a egalitarian of opportunity from that standpoint. And to me, I feel like, this could be one of the things that, this whole pandemic changes and sort of equalizes all of the opportunities in these roles that people now realize, could be done remotely. And, you see people in countries that might not have been, as fortunate to have these types of opportunities, see more of them going forward.
Okay, let's stay with that for a while, and allow me to present a somewhat contrarian perspective, because when we look at what's going on in the mainstream right now, they're talking about decoupling, they're talking about uncoupling, they're talking about rationalizing supply chains to make it less susceptible to disruptions like what we've experienced recently. Japan is putting money on the table, as in the government will give money to firms to help them reshore or pull out of China. The barriers are coming out of Europe. I mean, Europe was kind of like 50-50 before, but now definitely they are looking to restructure their supply chains as well. And of course, since President Trump has come into power, I mean, the relationship with Asia in general and China in particular has suffered. So, to the advantage of Mexico, to the advantage of other countries, and to the advantage of the US, to the extent that at least some of the services or whatever can come back on shore. So there's that supply chain rationalization. There's also, that comes in the context of economic nationalism. That's what put President Trump there. That's what put Brexit. That's what put Duterte in the Philippines and and everywhere else. And so not just on the political side, not just in terms of the big manufacturing companies, but the government policies. As you mentioned yourself when you spoke about your journey, how difficult it is right now to get a work visa to get into the US, and same in Europe. And in Europe now, even if a European citizen in certain countries, they marry a non-European, they cannot bring that non-European home. I mean, the walls have got that tall and that thick. So I wonder if there's not a wave of change going in the opposite direction, where it's less the globalization paradigm is being challenged, and the supporters of nationalism may be having their voices heard more than previously.
No, that's a fascinating point, and is one of the things that I mean, my year and a half at the Kennedy School, these types of things, were right up our wheelhouse, and I feel like there's the wave that you describe is definitely real. It's not a US thing. It's not a Western Europe thing. I think it's been a multi-year phenomenon now, on the heels of, I think, what is a multi-decade wave in the opposite direction. But one of the things that gives me, I'm unabashedly of the globalist camp, and not one of the nationalist camp. One of the things that gives me a lot of reassurance is that if you look at the segments of the populace that have been driving all the calls for nationalism and the calls for bringing the barriers up, they tend to be people that are generally older, generally people who for them it's a demographic that you could really blame a lot of the problems that whatever that country, whatever that society is facing on the other, which as a political tactic, it remains the far most effective tactic that you could do. First, it's far more easier to unite a populace or an electorate around a common external enemy than it is to give them complicated answers. And during an election campaign, complicated answers don't win votes. But if you look at, the younger generations, people who are, I don't want to like, draw a line in the sand at, any particular age per se, but the experience that people have had, particularly people who are sort of native to the internet, and they don't have the same sense of the other being like, the person to blame for whatever challenges that they face at home. I think somebody who is 15 years old in Vietnam has more in common with somebody who's 15 years old in New York City or in Trinidad than they do with somebody who is 65 years old in their own country. It's just a completely different worldview and mindset, and I feel like as more of these people who are the younger people that are native to like this globalization and sort of take it for granted that they could log on to YouTube and see videos that anybody else in the world has posted. They could log on to Instagram, on TikTok, and just connect with anybody else anywhere in the world like that. That phenomenon itself is just I wouldn't say insulates you, but it definitely gives you the globalization as like your default, like the global community as your default. If you think about people at the other extreme, the people who are really champions of nationalism and the wars going up, they're actually, I think, benefiting in sort of some ironic ways from the same phenomenon of connectivity, where they're able to go online on Facebook and find these communities of people who, years ago, it might not have been as easy to find, to use a random example, if you are a, white nationalist in the US, it might have been a lot harder to find a community of like-minded people years ago, before the advent of Facebook and these online communities versus now. So what I think you're seeing right now globally is it's sort of the I would like to think, I wouldn't make this statement definitively, but I'd like to think it's kind of like the last hurrah of that generation for whom the slogans like "Make America Great Again," they have this nostalgia for an era of life that, one, I think is sort of a myth. If you think back to what they're pining for and the supposed prosperity that they're thinking about, it's I don't think conditions were actually that way, that they sort of reminisce towards. And I think as that generation sort of moves on, you don't have an electorate that has the same like pining for past glory. If anything, the past glory that they're going to pine for is a more recent history of even more connectivity. So to the extent that the pendulum is still swinging in the nationalist direction, and you see that on the economic side in the supply chains maybe being repatriated, borders going up. I think when that pendulum sort of swings the other way, and I think it'll be swung the other way, led by technology companies, digital companies, you'll then see sort of a reversion to type where it's like, wait, so if my team is global and our half of our coders are in Bangalore, a quarter of the coders are in Ireland, a bunch of them are in Mexico City, like why don't we have these same type of benefits, or why don't we use the same type of philosophy in physical supply chains and other things like that? So I would like to think that the moves that we're seeing now, there's a difference, I think, and I think it's important to distinguish moves out of a place like China that are meant to diversify a supply chain, where you think to yourself, you know what, to the extent that there's a trade war and China becomes a place that is difficult to do business, we don't want to have all our supply chain in China. Let's have some in Vietnam, let's have some in the Philippines. That, I think, is healthy and consistent with, a globalized economy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to distinguish between some of those activities versus, this idea that autarky is the rule, and all Japanese goods are going to be made with an entirely Japanese supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
All German goods are going to be with an entirely German supply chain. Because at the end of the day, you have decades of empirical evidence, to the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you have this generation of people that are pining for the old days and pining for these nationalist tendencies that have, sort of moved on, I think, we could see the pendulum swing the other way. And, something like Brexit, to the extent I, live for 40, 50 more years, it would be completely surprising to me that, the UK doesn't rejoin the European Union. Because if you look at the demographics of people in, like, London in particular, younger people, like, these are people who, have traveled, people who personally reap the benefits of, being able to travel across Europe without, having borders. So people who are older that might have been in other parts of the UK that, they may not have traveled much, for them, that's not a benefit that's real to them, that's tangible to them. So, they don't really care about that. But I think you're going to see a shift in lots of parts of the world where, right now it might seem like the nationalists are winning the argument. I think they're winning the battle right now, but I don't think they're going to win the war.
Okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. Now, obviously, we can't be reductionist and say that one thing is causing another, because it's almost like a number of factors come together to create a social or an economic phenomena. When I look at some of the observers of people who comment on the push towards nationalism, they point to one of the key factors being the rise of income inequality. So we know that post Second World War, up until, let's say, the early 80s, it was the opposite. There was a shrinking, there was a reduction in the divide between the wealthy and the working class. Whereas since the 1980s, a number of policy, in the Western world specifically, you've seen that increasing. And more so in the Anglo-American sphere than, let's say, in the continent of Europe. And people argue that this has driven, at the end of the day, people vote with their wallet to some extent. So if it is that this generation in the US, this is the first generation that is not as well off, or not better off than their parents, but not even as well off as their parents, there's going to be pushback. And for some people, it wasn't just President Trump, but there was a lot of blurring of the lines, not in this election cycle, but the previous one between Trump and Bernie Sanders. People just wanted change. They said that the present model wasn't working in their favor. And when we look at Hong Kong, some of the observers there say that the underlying driver, there are many factors, but one of the underlying drivers is extreme income inequality in Hong Kong. Similarly in Paris, and wherever the media decides to shine a light. So I'm mentioning that because I'm curious to see how that reconciles with what you're saying. Because we're coming out of a pandemic, which, depending on who you listen to, can end up as either recession or depression or somewhere in between, then it kind of exacerbates that inequality piece that was driving unrest before. So I'm wondering whether what you've explained can still happen, where the younger people, who I agree are more predisposed towards a global or international mindset, would they not see their values or their perspective compromised by the fact that they're going to struggle a whole lot for the next X number of years?
Yeah. So, one of the challenges that globalization, I think, brings is that while, that point you mentioned where, you see widening income inequality in the US. There's some who would argue that, if you account for transfer payments, that's not necessarily the case. But even that argument aside, it's been the case that there's been less income equality globally. So that dynamic that I sort of touched on before, where, people in, Philippines and India and other parts of the world have been able to benefit not just from trade, but even like, outsourcing, other things of that sort. You've seen, vast amount of wealth creation in a lot of these places, and these huge segments of these populations have been lifted out of poverty.
True.
And I think there's an argument one could make that the extent to which these populations are now on a relative basis becoming more wealthier and seeing more wealth generation than their counterparts in the US and the West is a phenomenon that is not going to happen in perpetuity. It's a period of catch up, and regardless of whatever people's historical views are, where one might make the case that there have been periods in the past where the West may have exploited other countries, and this is the period where these other countries catch up. Regardless of, I'm agnostic to any of those arguments. The point is that it's going to be hard to make the argument to people of certain demographics, certain age group in the West that what your parents, your grandparents, and your great grandparents benefited from a lot of the extraction of wealth and in other parts of the world, and now it's their turn to like catch up to us. Like I don't know that argument is going to have, while potentially true, I don't know if that argument is going to have a lot of sway. So people on all sides of the ideological fence with respect to wealth generation and growth are going to have to seriously think about how do you structure things such that these people don't feel like they were just unlucky to be born in the year 1996 or 1997, and that too bad for them. Maybe in 2040 they'll start seeing gains. So whether the answer is the type of social security nets that you might see in Scandinavia and some of these places, or whether the solutions is to focus more on just generating as much growth as possible and having potentially more progressive taxation regime in these places. I don't think it's going to be a one size fit all solution in every place, but I think some of the key things for people to focus on are the facts that you can't tax your way to prosperity. Like, I think there are people who I've spoken to a lot of people who Bernie Sanders supporters, Elizabeth Warren supporters, and I think there's this fixed pie fallacy where people think that the economy or the wealth generated is one particular pie, and if some person or some group of people in an economy are getting wealthier, they're doing it at the expense of some other person. And I always counter to people, well, think back before we had developed an advanced economies. Like the question you shouldn't, the question you ask, or the right question to ask is not why are some people rich. The question, I think, is why aren't we all poor? Because that's where ultimately we all started as in societies, as agrarian societies, where we didn't have stores of wealth. So it's important, while we think about safety nets and we try to make sure that just as being a caring person in a society, you want to make sure that people could get the kind of support that they need, particularly in an environment like this, where people who haven't had savings, people who are at lower ends of the economic strata, a quarantine isn't something that they have a luxury of enjoying, and being on Instagram posting memes, it's a real challenging thing where they're either out of work and they don't have savings, so figuring out what are they going to do,
Mm-hmm.
or if they continue to work, in areas like food delivery, things like that. So they're putting themselves on the front line and putting themselves at greatest risk.
Mm-hmm.
And then, compound that, very often these are the demographics that don't have health insurance, and, they're in a challenging position. So I don't think it's inconsistent to want to structure a society, to structure an economy that remains focused on growth, remains oriented to the idea that we are growing this pie, that, more wealth, more, prosperity is possible for society writ large. I don't think it's inconsistent to want that, and to also think, okay, because of where we are, zoom out, 100 years, where we are at this stage, the next 10 to 20 years, the expectations that significant portions of Western societies had, people who are in 15 to 25, 15 to 30, 35 age groups, the expectations that they would have had relative to what they may have seen their parents experience may potentially not be met, whether it's a function of not the same level of growth, or that the distribution of wealth generated is now not being concentrated in the West, and these swaths of countries that were not participating in the past are now participating in the global economy to a greater degree. Like, thought must be given to helping these people not feel disenfranchised, not feel like they were sold a bill of goods that's no longer coming true, and that the only solace we give to them is, hey, too bad, you're born in the wrong time frame. You should have been born 40 years ago or 40 years in the future. You were born now, so like, sucks to be you. Like that there must be scope for designing economic and social programs to help alleviate some of these stresses that these people feel, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just casting away the systems that have led so many basically billions of people in the world to emerge from poverty and emerge from the state that we were in 200 years ago. I mean, when you look at a graph of global GDP from the year of our Lord to now, I mean, it's a chart that it crawls along at the bottom of the axis, and then from mid 1800s it's suddenly asymptotic. So I mean, the average person today, we're experiencing levels of comfort and just material comforts that were unimaginable to people who were at the pinnacle of human society decades ago. So I don't think we discard the entire system, but we certainly can't just leave these affected groups and these disenchanted groups to flounder with respect to what their outcomes would be going forward. So there has to be a balance, and I think too often the rhetoric you hear from politicians makes it seem like it's an either or. You have politicians that tell you if we don't cut taxes down to zero and just no social safety net, if unless you're doing that, it's socialism, it's communism, and we don't want any of that. And then on the other extreme, you have people who say billionaires shouldn't exist. Nobody should have wealth above $5 million. If you have wealth above that, we need to tax it away. That's, in my opinion, a completely false narrative of those two extremes. There must be sensible ways to continue to have growth, be something that's important to society. Because at the end of the day, when you look at metrics like life expectancy, metrics like live births per thousand across the world, economies and countries that are wealthier, that generate more wealth, have better life outcomes, be it across health outcomes. So it's important to continue to connect that idea to people that, you know, we can't have a socialist utopia and expect growth to magically happen, but we also don't have to have a society where there's absolutely no social safety net at all. Like, you know, it's possible to have both things.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I would divide them into, I'd bifurcate the discussion into two parts. One, there's the need for revisiting the social structure within the country and with a view to addressing issues of income inequality within the nation. And then,
Right.
secondly, there's a need to have a discussion as to how we can bridge the divide between the wealthy countries and the not so wealthy countries and that emerging gap there. In terms of the first one, yeah, there's been, you know, different people that have come along in this election cycle, and again, well, and the one before as well, pushing the whole idea of what we call socialism. But we seem to forget somehow that in that period in post-World War II to 1980, where the income gap shrunk the most in US history, that also coincided with a 75% income tax rate. The highest marginal tax rate was 75%. And we did have a New Deal. We created Medicaid. We created Medicare. We decided to, as I'm speaking as a US person as well,
Right.
to take care of the people who weren't doing so well as we tried to pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. So somehow it wasn't seen as socialism. The debate and the narrative at that point in time is just, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, you know. We created for the first time the estate taxes to, you know, to more or less punish intergenerational wealth transfer, or to try and even things out a little bit and create opportunities for those at the bottom of the structure. So we can't ignore the fact that we had a policy framework which included high taxes and whatever, which somehow, maybe it was not a causal relationship, perhaps it was a correlation, I don't know, but I'm just saying it's something to explore.
Yeah.
That saw that shrinking. And then as we reversed that, as we had President Reagan come in the 1980s, and we had the biggest change in the US tax code at that point, which was the only time we've done as drastic a remodel of the US tax code was under President Trump. So when President Reagan was done with it, and we had the age of Wall Street with Michael Douglas, greed is good, and we came up with a new revised notion of what capitalism is. And suddenly we began to dismantle that safety net, and we saw, coincidentally or not, who knows, an expansion or an increase in the divide in the Gini coefficient, and the divide between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. So, you know, I take your point. Yes, as we come out of this, the society needs to have a discussion, an internal dialogue to figure out, okay, what do we want to do from now? And if it is that we want to address what will be glaring inequalities, you know, assuming that the economic downturn is going to last for a while, which it would, perhaps we need to change some of the underlying government policies as well. Now, in terms of the gap between the wealthy and the not so wealthy countries, or the emerging markets, as we try to refer to them, you know, they're going to be hit even harder because, you know, like a country like the Philippines or Indonesia, the emerging markets tend to rely disproportionately on commodity exports, primary production, and oil and gas are pretty weak right now as the Saudis and the Russians do their due, and the US has now become a net energy exporter. So, you know, the whole shape of the energy market is fundamentally changed, and perhaps to the disadvantage of the emerging economies that depended on it, including Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't see that changing in the near term, because we have a structural shift in demand downwards as well that needs to be, along with the oversupply, then they need to kind of somehow reconcile themselves. And then to a lot of the commodity exporting nations, including even Australia, I mean, it's not just limited to emerging markets. They rode a wave that was, you know, that was moving on the back of what was going on in China. And even pre-pandemic, China's growth rate was slowing down. And one would expect that post-pandemic, the trend would not reverse itself, especially when you're telling me that the main importing markets in Japan, Europe, North America are going to be raising the tariff and non-tariff barriers. So that will impact China and will impact all those that were relying on commodity exports into China, because China won't need as much. So, so when I look at that, and then in terms of portfolio investment, how much has been in the last few weeks? Is it 100 billion that has been pulled out of emerging markets? And I'm sure it's going to continue, because suddenly those buoyant consumer markets, real estate markets, whatever it was, is not as attractive. So these guys, they don't have that social safety net. They don't have the ability to write blank checks. They can't create huge stimulus packages. Japan is going to send $1,000 to each citizen. So they're going to really feel it. And I think at least in the short to medium term is going to increase that gap between the wealthy and the not so wealthy countries. And to take your point, I agree with you that the wealthy countries and the younger people who matured at this stage in our history need to have a conversation that also extends to what our responsibilities are to our neighbors or people who are from other countries. And I mean, again, going back to the post-World War to 1980 period, they had that conversation and they had the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
And they basically gave Europe a blank check. They gave Britain a lot of money. I think Britain only paid back a few years ago, like sometime in the last decade, Great Britain wrote its last check on the money that it owed to the US. It's because the US extended itself, both in terms of grants and loans, to bring other countries up. Obviously, that's no longer the case, but perhaps that's a conversation again to have. So I'm just saying all that to echo and to support your point that we are at a junction where there needs to be a lot of soul searching by the younger generation as they come into maturity at this time and they become part of the political process.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I think has the potential to be a big part of that, and you're seeing you see a little bit of a preview of it with the COVID-19 response, notwithstanding, the US has not necessarily been the paragon of global cooperation under this administration, but I think to the extent that the next administration's one, led by President Biden, you'd probably see a revision to global cooperation. But, the next thing down the path beyond COVID-19, is going to be climate change. And when you think about the type of global cooperation you're going to need to address that, I think it's an opportunity to sort of think about, okay, the costs and the burdens of climate change are something that we need to have like a global conversation about in terms of which groups, which countries, how we share the burden of that. And I think that lends itself to then say, okay, so in terms of the global economic framework, what type of Marshall Plan-esque things are we going to need to have, are we going to, put in place to, continue to support growth? Because at the end of the day, I think 2020 and onward, it's a completely different global economy in terms of where companies in the West look to as their potential markets. It's no longer the case that a company in the US is entirely focused on the US as their potential market. China, other parts of Asia, the developing world, are now significant components of that. So to the extent back in, the 40s and 50s, some people would argue that, the Marshall Plan was, had some, undertones of race where, white countries were basically the countries that people thought mattered, and that's where, people paid attention. But I think even if only for self-serving reasons, the scope of countries that people consider to be part of the relevant community is going to be broader and more inclusive, because these are the places where companies in the West have their, supply chains, notwithstanding any short-term, consolidation or repatriation. It's still in many companies in the West interest to have a global supply chain footprint. So these companies and by extension, these countries now have a vested interest in making sure that the rest of the world doesn't fall apart. And I think at the end of the day, that interconnectedness is what younger generations view as in default. So I think it's going to be easier to make the political sell necessary for them to understand. Look, like at the end of the day, they're going to need to be some. We're not saying that every country has to be equal. We're not saying that across the globe the GDP per capita in every country must be equal. But to the extent that there are countries in crisis, to the extent that there are countries that need significant support from the World Bank, significant support from the IMF, significant support from the multilateral organizations, the regional organizations. The funding from these organizations, doesn't, they don't borrow the money from Mars. I mean, there are certain countries, wealthier countries, the US and others, that ultimately help capitalize these institutions. And to the extent that there is going to be a need for, an order of magnitude larger amount of capitalization, it doesn't necessarily have to take the form of, direct funding. It could be the case that we now have the need to, support mechanisms for these entities to, issue bonds of their own, to, tap capital markets in a way that they previously haven't. I feel like there are a number of different things that we've not, fully explored because perhaps they were not as politically tenable 20 years ago, 60 years ago. If you think back to like the Bretton Woods era of redrawing the global financial architecture, if we were to have a new Bretton Woods, 5 years, 10 years from now, I think, you could draw a completely different architecture because, again, the countries that matter, the communities that matter in 2025 and 2030 are, a different list than the ones that mattered, in the 70s. It's a longer list and, quite frankly, a better list. And, I think political support for what, would be necessary to facilitate some of these changes to the architecture. I think once we tie them to the fact that these are things that the global community needs, these are things that, might be required to address things like climate change, I think that the political leadership will have, to the extent that they're willing to go in this direction, and it's not like the type of administration in the US today. There'll be the support among the populace for these types of changes, but it's not going to happen in a vacuum. I think very often you need a crisis, of sorts, like the one we're in now, to spur global cooperation. And to the extent that you have a US that is not solely focused inward, not looking to cast blame and disparage global organizations, but one that uses these organizations to try to improve outcomes for everybody everywhere. I think we could see a lot of these things that I think might need to happen for this type of these type of architectural changes, and these types of whatever we call it, Marshall Plan 2, or whoever president we or general we name these things after going forward.
Okay, great, food for thought. As a final question, do you see any particular geographies or sectors that may be attractive investments if someone were looking for an investment opportunity, or if someone would want to keep an eye on a sector or geography that will do disproportionately well as we emerge from the situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people, I think, notwithstanding the potential unreliability of their numbers, I mean, I think it's generally acceptable that China is coming out of this in a relatively better place than most others.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, from a geography standpoint, I had always sort of pegged Asia as, a region that, has a, good multi-decade setup. And to the extent, growth out of China at least recovers sooner than, most other parts of the world, and they could continue to lead that, it should bode well for Asia as a region overall. I think, at least over the next 5 years, the lingering after effects of the trade war and people's unwillingness to put all their eggs in a China basket and seek diversification across the region. You see places like Vietnam and the Philippines, I think, benefit from both continued growth coming out of China, but then also companies in the West, looking for other non-China jurisdictions in the region that are lower cost, that have certain minimum levels of infrastructure and young population, well-educated population, places that are still well integrated into global supply chains, and then away from the region, I think lots of different parts of Africa have a lot of promise. I mean, recently enacted free trade agreements within Africa, as a continent, I think they've seen a lot of false starts in over the decades, but I'm optimistic that this could be something that has legs to it, and to the extent that there's continued investment from China, in terms of building infrastructure, it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of some of the debt that might be tied to some of these infrastructure projects, and what might come of the sovereigns per se, and their ability to have their finances in place. But I think it doesn't change the story that the actual infrastructure in place in all of these sub-Saharan African countries is going to be there. And I think the economic axis of the globe is shifting away from the Atlantic, where US and Europe was sort of the two main nodes, and that sort of ocean was where the economic gravity was. It's shifting to the Indian Ocean, where you think of all of Asia, India, and I think Africa as well. And within that orbit, if you had to think where which is the region that I think has the more catching up to do, that would benefit from more interconnected supply chains, more trade, more technological solutions that would facilitate people working remotely, and plugging into global growth in other parts of the world, because they have well-educated, English-speaking young populations that are going to be learning to code, that are going to be learning to do digital marketing. Like it's hard to imagine Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, wouldn't be playing a part of that. And to get into specific countries, places like Rwanda and Kenya, I think Nigeria, South Africa, to the extent that they're able to avoid significant civil and geopolitical conflict that sort of derails what I think is a promising setup. I think all of these regions are places that I think will have a lot of promise. And I say that from with my not just with my hedge fund investing hat on, but with my mission or entertainment entrepreneur hat on. Part of my whole strategy, once I build out my initial subsidiary companies in the US, and have initial footprint, build somebody like analytics IP that, and acquire some of the content I want to in that jurisdiction. My next step is to travel the world and look for. I have a list of developing economies with populations of 100 million or greater that I want to find local capital partners, build out content, and a lot of these same types of roles. I talked about coding, digital marketing. Like they're going to be just such swaths of talent that are coming onto the market in all these places. And me personally, that's where I'm going to be sort of making my bets, for my company as well, in a lot of these places in Asia, Vietnam, Nigeria, Kenya, like a lot of these places, and haven't even scratched the surface of lots of parts of Latin America as well, where I think you have lots of similar setups there. Mexico, I think a lot of interesting things happening there. So again, I'm friends and family members of mine always categorize me as the eternal optimist. I always try to find the silver lining and the bright side, but I do look past this next 2-3 years of, I think, downturn that's going to be direct result of the COVID-19 situation, and potentially maybe some of these short-term nationalist political reactions to that. I look past that and through that to, I think, a period where the barriers eventually come down. It's just so hard to restrain global capital flows and labor, particularly when you think about all these technology rules and the ability to access labor globally. And it'll be like you're trying to catch water with a net, and I think it'll eventually prove to be futile to the nationalists, and I think the globalist cause will win the day eventually.
Wow, the globalist cause will win the day. I like that. On that note, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
It's good to connect with you again. And
same here.